And I have an empty Visual Studio going on right now, so I'm going to create a new website. Now I'm going to have different options here. If I'd like to add ASPX type files into this particular website project, then I could create just a regular ASP.NET website, but since I'm going to create an actual web service, I'm going to go ahead and select that. And what that'll do is add an ASMX file. So I'm going to call this WS Demo. All right, so we now have a simple web service that .NET has created for us. And you'll see that we have a web method called Hello World, which I'm going to remove. We'll add to that. My actual web service is called Service. Now, obviously, I could come in and change that. I can always add a new item or rename this. We'll go ahead and just keep it for simplicity. Now, to create a web service is actually pretty easy. Once you've created a web service project like I just did here, and you have your ASMX file, then you can simply add a method. So, as an example, if I wanted to return a customer object or even multiple customers from a particular web service, then I could go ahead and write this just like a method. Now I don't have a customer object. We'll write that in just a moment. But let's call this getCustomer. And we'll say it takes a string representing the customer ID. I could then add on the web method attribute, which is a required attribute for .NET Web Services. This will expose it as what we call an operation in the web service lingo. Now, there's a lot of more work. What a lot of people will do when they first get into web services is they'll put all of their code inside of this web method, which certainly works, but it's not quite as reusable. As an example, while anyone can hit a web service, there may be times when you don't want to have to go through the web service to get this specific data. So it makes a lot of sense to actually put that functionality in a separate class and then consume that class from here. So I'll explain a little more what I mean as we get going here. Now, another thing you might see from time to time with web services is people will return data sets. And while ADO.NET data sets certainly work, the problem you're going to run into is they're not very interoperable across other platforms and other languages. Java, as an example, would certainly be able to work with this, but a data set will get serialized or converted into XML. And Java would have no way of knowing what's in the XML without actually inspecting the SOAP message that they get back from this web service. And that'll take some work on their part. And of course, if we ever change it on our end, they'd have to reinspect, and it's just a big hassle. It's not very good for interoperability. So although datasets work, I would recommend not using those unless you're just using pure .NET clients that are going to be consuming this web service. So we're going to come back to this in just a bit, and we're actually going to write a customer. So in an earlier video I did on building N-layer ASP.NET applications, I demonstrated how we can create a model, business, and data layer using the app code folder, and you could even use separate class library type projects as well. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to go ahead and add in a couple folders here. So I'm going to add in a business layer folder. I'll add in a data layer folder, and I'm going to add in something I call the model, which I'll explain. So this is kind of a standard thing I do. Now, I normally create separate projects for these, but in cases where they are only used by this particular project, then this is certainly fine. So the first thing is we would like to return some customer data from the Northwind database. So if I run over to my Server Explorer, you'll see I don't have any Northwind there, but I can go ahead and add in a Northwind database that I already have. So let me grab this. And I have this in another project. So I'm going to basically add that in as a SQL Express database. And you'll see now I have Northwind available. Now, obviously, you could certainly hit an enterprise database or hit your own data, but I'll use Northwind because it's simple and most people have access to it. So the goal of this particular exercise is going to be inside of this Northwind database. Once it opens up here, I have some customer data in the customers table, and I'd basically like to be able to return at least one customer. And we could do multiples as well. So we'll say that I want to return just maybe these top 4 or 5 fields here: company name, contact title, maybe. So what I'm going to do first is I need to model the data that this particular web service is going to return. So I'm going to go ahead and in my model layer, and I call this my my model, but it's basically just my data entity classes. It's the buckets that hold the data that get passed around. So I'm going to add a new class into here. And I'm going to go ahead and call this class customer.cs. And this will be along the lines of what I did in an earlier video if you're interested. Try to keep it a little bit consistent there. So I'm just going to whip out a couple properties here really quickly. And so I'm going to use the good old code snippets, do prop tab tab, and we're going to do customer ID. Let's go ahead and create company name. And we'll just do one more. We'll do contact name. Okay, so that's pretty much it for that class. Now, in an earlier video on building end-layer ASP.NET apps, I also showed how you can use some schema type generation, as well as in a WCF video as well. So feel free to check those out if you're interested. But this is pretty quick, very easy using code snippets. So I'm going to rearrange my fields a little nicer, the way I like them. And there we go. So now we have our fields, we have our properties, and we have our data entity class. Now I don't actually need any of these other namespaces. All right, so next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to wrap this in a namespace. I'm going to call it model. And that always represents my data entity classes for projects I typically work on. All right, so model.customer will get me into this. So let's go ahead and change this now to model.customer is what's going to get returned, and we'll have to write some code here to accept the customer ID, hit the database, and then basically fill that customer object and return it. So next thing I'm going to do is go to my data layer here and add in a class. And again, to keep consistent with other videos, I'm going to call this data access layer, DAL. You'll typically want to name that a little more specifically. But I'm going to go ahead and add in a static method here that returns a model.customer object, and I'm going to call it getCustomer. And it's going to look just like the web service method for the most part. Let me give it a little more room here. All right. And what I'm going to do in here is basically hit the database and fill that model object with some data. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go in and run over to my Solution Explorer, and I'm going to add in a web.config file, mainly because I just need to add in a connection string. So let's add in a connection string. We'll name it constring and give it a connection string value based upon my web.config, or my my SQL database I showed you earlier. Now I'm going to go ahead and steal from this since it's a SQL Express one, and I don't have those memorized, but I know I have one in here. All right. Okay, so let's go on back, and basically I'm just going to cut and paste this guy in. That should give us our SQL Express reference. And SQL Express, if you haven't seen it before, it's a little different than if you hit a normal, more enterprise type database that's, a standalone type database. It does have some unique syntax, which I've never taken the time to memorize. So, okay, let me take a look at this. Looks good. So we have our connection string. Next thing I'm going to do is inside of this, I'm going to wrap this in a namespace called data, just to prevent potential naming conflicts. And I'm going to reference the system.data.sql client namespace. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that connection string, and I'm going to use the configuration manager class and say go to the connection strings called constring and grab that. Next thing we'll do is we'll create our connection. I'm going to use a data reader. And then we'll go ahead and add a little try catch here, and we'll want to catch an exception. I'll call it EXP. All right, so in here, we're going to basically create a new instance of our connection object, and we'll feed it the connection string. We'll then create a SQL command object, and we'll feed it the SQL that we want, as well as the connection. Now, I'm going to go ahead, and I would highly recommend using store procedures here, but I'm going to go ahead and just use some regular inline SQL, just to keep it quick and dirty. So I'm going to say select customer ID, contact name, company name, and I believe that was the only ones I needed. Let's check this out. Customer ID, contact name, company name. Yep. From customers, where customer ID equals whatever they pass in. Okay, and again, if you watched any of the other videos I've done recently, this should look a little bit familiar. I'm trying to keep a bit on the consistent side. So we'll pass this in along with the connection to use. We'll then open up our connection, and now we're ready to get our data reader and basically walk through the fields and fill the object. So first thing I'm going to do is get my data reader. So I'm going to say my reader is achieved or accessed by calling execute reader. And then I'm going to call reader.read, which will get me to the first row of data. All right, and I should only have one row based upon my SQL. Now, there's certainly other checks we could do to make sure we have a row before we call this, such as checking has rows. But from here, what we're going to do is create a new model customer object. And we're basically just going to fill the particular data that we want to return from this, ultimately from this method, which the web service will return. So we'll go to the reader's customer ID field. We'll go to the contact name. And we'll go to the company name. Okay. Now I'm going to add a finally down here. We're pretty much at that point done with our reader, but we'll want to, if we get an error or not, we'll want to close things up. So if we do get an error, we could certainly add logging capabilities. I'm going to go ahead and basically just write to the trace output. So I'm going to get access to the current context, and just as a quick and dirty way to write out if there's an error, we'll turn on tracing here. So I'll say error. All right, and actually I meant to do trace.warn right there. All right. Down here, we're going to make sure we have a reader. If the reader's not null, we're going to go ahead and close it. And we'll close the connection if it doesn't equal null, and the connection state does not equal connection state closed. Okay. Now, going back up here, so that basically handles hitting the database. We read our single row of data. We map that to our data we're going to return from ultimately from the web service. And next thing I need to do, of course, is just return the customer, since that's what we said we're going to return out of this particular method. Now, if there's an error and we don't return, then down here at the bottom, I'm just going to return null so that we get something back. So let me do a quick build, fix any typos that's found, and we'll move on. Okay, and that's expected. We haven't finished the web service yet, so we'll get back to that one. All right, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a real quick business wrapper object here. And now I don't have any business rules to add in this case, but again, this is something I do on every project. So I'm going to add a new class into my business layer, and we'll call this business access layer. Strip out the constructor, wrap it in a namespace called biz. And basically, this is just going to wrap this call to this guy, to our get customer. So I'm going to paste that in. All right, so this is nothing more than a gateway into our data layer, which actually gets the data. Now, this is where we could apply some business rules. So as an example, if every company name had have the keyword Acme on the end of it, we could certainly do that here. So we could do something like the following, just as a simple business rule. We could call data.dal.getCustomer, pass in this cust ID, and then we could do some business rules here and say that all customers that have a company name need to keep that company name, but we need to add on Acme. We'll say that's some weird business rule we have. But obviously, you could do all kinds of stuff. You could do if statements. You could do lookups to other rules, and so on and so forth in this layer. So I'm going to return my customer object. All right, so that basically takes care, going back to our layers here, that takes care of the bucket that's going to get returned from the web service, the object called customer. We have our data access layer, which calls the database. We have our business access layer, which calls the data layer. And now our web service is actually going to call into the business layer. So the web service really is going through multiple layers to actually get the data, and that allows me to not only debug a little better, but it allows for better code reuse. I could have a web page that also uses this business and data access layer classes as well without having to go through the web service if I wanted. And of course, I could put these into a separate DLL by making separate projects. All right, so the final thing we need to do here is in our web service, we need to return our customer. So I'm going to go ahead and just call into the business layer, get customer, and pass in the cust ID, and that returns a model.customer object, so we'll just return that directly. So you can see that my web method right here, get customer, is extremely simple because all of the logic and the data access and filling the data and all that type of stuff is done with these other layers. And that's really kind of best practice for reuse, and that makes it so your web services are nothing more than wrappers around existing functionality you might have in your enterprise. Now the final thing I'm going to do, tempuri.org is going to be the namespace used in the SOAP messages, the request and response messages. I'm going to go ahead and change that to my website. Now you would obviously be able to put whatever you want there, your company name, your department if you wanted. It just has to be a unique identifier. All right, so let's go ahead and try to build. See what kind of errors, if any. All right, looks like it built. That's a good start. Next thing I'm going to do is try to test it. So if you haven't done this before with .NET, .NET automatically builds in the capability to actually try your web service before anything else happens. So I'm going to do view in browser right on the ASMX file. And once this jits, we should get a nice little test page that we can try out. So you can see that I have my WSDL, my web service description language, all generated for me. Now, you'll notice the WSDL is very good, and Java and other clients should be able to interact with this fairly easily because it's very clear what they're getting back. They're getting back a customer object that has this data. Had I used something that's more generic, like a data set, you wouldn't see what's being returned. None of this would be here. In fact, it would just say any inside of this, and they wouldn't really know until they test the service and try it out. All right, so let's try it out real quick. And you can see it does work. We get back our single customer, our company name, and notice our little fake business rule was applied. And we're ready to go. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is basically how can we consume this service. So let's assume that we have a client, whether it's ASP.NET, Windows Forms, could be Java, doesn't really matter, that needs to actually consume this service. So what I'll do is on my solution, I'll add in a new website to simulate. We have an ASP.NET site here, and we'll call this WS Consumer. All right, so now that my web service itself is done, I can simply call the service, but I need to know the WSDL. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a web reference here. And the way I'm going to do that is simply right-click on the website. We'll add a web reference, and normally, if this was a more real-world site, I would type in the WSDL path, which you can find from UDDI. I like to go to xmethods.com or some other sites to find these, but Visual Studio puts a nice little cheat here where we can say web services in solution. There's my service I just made. And this should bring back that we have a single web method. There it is, get customer, and we could test it out right here. Now this web reference name is going to be basically the namespace, and localhost will be the default since I'm running it locally, but we're going to call it, well, that's actually not what I wanted. So let me try that again. Hit enter too fast. We're going to go in and we're going to call this web reference WS Proxies for the namespace. All right, there we go. So we'll add a reference in, and you can see it added the WSDL here into the project, which will dynamically get generated, or dynamically this will be generated into a class at runtime. So the final thing I need to do is basically come into my website, and I'm going to just add in a text box and a simple button so we can type in a customer ID. So let's run over to the toolbox. We'll type in customer ID. We'll allow them to enter it into a text box. We'll have a button, and we'll write the results of the customer data out to a label. So when they do the button here, we'll probably want to go ahead and name this a little more specific. Call it submit. And now that we have our button, we can go ahead and double click on it. And now we can call the web service. So I used a namespace of WS Proxies. There's my service class. I'm going to call it proxy. So that creates a new instance of this proxy class that was generated automatically from the WSDL that you saw that was inside of this web references right here. All right, the next thing we're going to do is say proxy dot, and we should see a get customer, and you can see we do, and we'll pass in the customer ID from the text box. Now if we mouse over get customer, you can see that it returns a customer object. So there's our customer object. We'll call it cust. And once we get that back from the web service, we're going to write out the results to a label. And we'll just write out the contact name just to show that it's working. So you can see calling the web service is very simple. Simply create the proxy object, create a new instance, call the appropriate web method that the proxy automatically generates based upon the WSDL, get back that result, and then obviously handle it. All right, so let me go ahead and build my solution just to make sure we don't have any typos. Looks like it builds okay. All right, I'm going to make sure our port is going here. I'm going to run our web page. And now we should be able to type in the customer ID and hopefully get back some results. And there we go. So that is an example of the fundamentals of creating a web service. So I hope that gives you a good idea of what's involved. Now, obviously, you don't have to go to all the work I did here with the biz, data, and model. Your fastest way is just to throw the code right in the web method. However, it's not recommended simply because that does limit the reuse of that code. It's a lot better. You're a lot better off if you can put that in a separate object. So that'll be the end of this particular tutorial. Thanks for watching, and check back to my blog fairly often. I try to do videos frequently, so thanks a lot.